Very briefly, just in terms of Vercida Consulting, we're part of Vercida Group. If you haven't done already, do go and visit our virtual stands. You know, we've got a whole bunch of colleagues there that can tell you more about what we do. But in essence, Vercida Group, the first thing that we do is we have an online platform which is designed to basically encourage organizations to attract diverse talent. And that's vercida.com. And then Vercida Consulting, outside of the business, really works with organizations. Once you have, you know, diverse talent in the business, what do you do with them? So how do we make sure we create cultures which are inclusive? And we do that through training, strategy, and the rest of it. But do go and check out the virtual stand, either not now, because I'm presenting now, but perhaps later on. You can do that. That'd be fab. So it's really, really interesting, actually. And we're glad to be presenting, and we're also glad to be sponsoring, because obviously, I think it is fair to say that right now the world is pretty much in crisis, actually, on a number of levels. One, clearly with coronavirus, that is presenting a whole bunch of challenges to businesses and business leaders now. But also when we look across the pond and see what's happening in the US, I think, you know, without being overly political, I think it's fair to say that the US is in crisis in terms of what's happening over there. And in the UK, you know, we can't exempt ourselves from those issues. And some of those issues sound like they're social issues, but they impact the world of work as well. So what we have to do in a business context is to think about how do we make sure that we diversify our workforce in order to do something, okay? And I'll talk to you about what that means as we go through. But, you know, one of the questions that I get as I sort of travel the world talking to senior leaders is, Dan, I'm so committed to diversity and inclusion, and I'm, you know, doing all I can to attract diverse talent, but actually I've got to look after the organizational culture that we have. And how can I get this balance right? I mean, if I was given £1 for every time I was asked that question, I'd be a very rich individual now. And I think it's an interesting question. I think in many ways there are some complexities around that, but I do think there's a way to navigate the balance between the need to increase diversity and the need to maintain strong organizational culture. So they're the themes we'll kind of explore. I think the first thing that we should do is obviously do a bit of a definition. It's really important that when I talk about diversity, that we're not only talking about the obvious things. So of course I'm thinking about, you know, things like race and gender and disability and age and all of the kind of core, you know, characteristics that we're used to talking about. But I'm actually thinking much broader than that. I'm thinking about, you know, introverts and extroverts, different thinking styles. I, in addition to my day job, chair the Lord Mayor of London's Power of Inclusion Network. This morning we had a virtual event. We had over 100 people on there, and we were talking about social mobility and bringing people who are different into business from a you know, different social backgrounds, etc. So it's really important that when we think of diversity, we think of diversity in this really broad sense. And that's important because the second question for us is, well, why do we want organizations which are diverse in the first place? I mean, you know, what's the point of this conversation? And I think it's fair to say, and I'm not going to go through all the kind of hardcore data with you this afternoon, you know, all that data from McKinsey and BCG and the rest of it. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. And if not, we will send you some information out there later. But I think the first obvious thing to say is, in the context, and particularly now, in the context when, you know, globalization is defined by certain factors, you know, uncertainty, unpredictability, turbulence, etc., having people who are too similar, and too similar not just based on, you know, race and gender, but particularly similar based on mindset and thinking is very, very problematic. And it will become increasingly problematic because when we have too much similarity of thinking, as I'm sure you're all aware, we fall into groupthink. And groupthink is difficult or you know, creates a set of problems for us when we're trying to tune into and connect to our external stakeholders. So it's very difficult for organizations to adapt and change to external circumstances when we have too much similarity around the decision-making table. So the starting point for me around, if you like, the business case for diversity is not about profitability. I think that looks after itself. I think the starting point is about saying, how can we make sure we have teams that are different? And we talk about this kind of, promoting a notion of collective intelligence, an idea of this zooming out effect, a spanning out effect, in order to tune into people so that we can understand what their needs and wants are. And once we get that level of difference, that's where we can start to be creative, and that's where we get, the innovation and the creativity, and therefore the profit that we all need. I'll come back to something really important later, which is the notion that diversity in an organization is only one half, if you like, of a two-sided coin. So those rewards that we want in terms of innovation, creativity, high levels of employee motivation, employee belonging, etc., you don't get those from diversity, actually. And most organizations, quite frankly, are making a big strategic error. One of the things that they do is they hire for diversity, but then when they have difference in the organization, they say, now you're here, be a bit more like us. So the irony is they hire for difference, but then they drown it out. They drown it out because they want people to conform to organizational norms. So the objective is not actually about diversity. The objective is about saying, how do we make a strategic connectivity or a strategic alignment between difference and organizational inclusivity or organizational belonging? And I'll say more about that later in terms of, well, what does that actually mean? How do we define, being inclusive, or how do we find cultures which are belonging? Now, this is all grand and fine, but there is a fundamental problem. And you all probably know already that the fundamental problem is you and I, as human beings, we are prone to a set of a whole bunch of social and cognitive biases. Now, I won't go through all of these. I'm sure you're all familiar with, the many biases that we have. In fact, you may know already that there are over 150 biases. So, in a way, we've got all of this great positive intention, but we've got this massive wall of biases which are stacking up against what our intentions are, are about, essentially. And that just, really causes a big problem. So not really for now, but for a different presentation. I know you've heard some stuff about biases earlier this morning. It is about saying, if we want to have a diverse workforce, we've got to think about things like, well, how does bias, creep into, the job design process? How does bias, particularly things like the affinity bias and confirmation bias, really impact that interview setting and the rest of it? So there's all of these kind of biases swirling around, which are getting in the way. And so, in many ways, thinking about how we can mitigate bias on two levels. One is the system level, so mitigating bias from our processes, and one is the behavioural level. That's the first step. And I'm sure your organisation's done a whole bunch of work around, bias mitigation and all of that. In fact, at Vercida, we have an inclusive recruitment toolkit, actually. And what we'll do is we'll send everybody perhaps a copy of that after today. But the main essence of the conversation is this, really, is this: how do we balance this need for diversity that we've talked about? We've talked about why we want it, while at the same time, holding on to, the values and the glue, the culture which holds us together, actually. So there's a couple of points which I just want to make on these sides of the conversation, actually. One is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean by that is that having what we call kind of corporate connectivity, having a sense of, if you like, similarity, having a sense of sameness, actually, in many ways, is actually very good for organizations. So, having individuals, and groups of people who align to, an organization's value, align to the organization's mission statements, its sense of purpose, is really, really good. And there's lots of evidence that says, when we have individuals that align to an organization's sense of purpose, we actually get very strong levels. We get a real uptake in team cohesion, a real sense of belonging, a real sense of that kind of psychological connectivity to the organization, the rest of it. And that puts an organization in really, really good stead. I mean, I guess at the moment, if you think about, the NHS, the NHS clearly has, a whole set of values, which is the fundamental being of what the NHS is all about. And you can see clearly right now, actually, in terms of the coronavirus pandemic, that there are team members from all sorts of hugely diverse. In fact, the NHS is probably one of the most diverse organisations in the UK, if definitely not one of the most diverse organisations in the whole world. And what we see in the NHS right now is a sense of this kind of collective kind of bonding and this kind of mission, if you like, to beat the coronavirus. And that's really awesome in terms of what it's trying to do. There's lots of examples of different charities, many years ago I did a big strategy piece for Amnesty International, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with the work of Amnesty International. They do lots of work around human rights, around the world. And it's really interesting, actually, with Amnesty. They are clearly, their mission is, about promoting human rights and the rest of it. And having individuals who align to that core mission just create that sense of bonding and purpose and the rest of it. So we know that having corporate connectivity or this bonding effect, and if you like, some elements of similarity is not always a bad thing. It can be a good thing. One of the things that we also need to be mindful of, and it's really interesting in terms of what the evidence tells us, and you might be surprised that I would say this as a diversity practitioner, but actually difference if it's not managed effectively, and difference if we don't have a sense of organisational inclusivity or organisational belonging, can actually be a source of conflict. It can be a source of disconnect, actually. And if you think about the whole conversation right now in terms of race equality, what is happening in the US, that conversation clearly has moved way beyond racial inequalities in society. And the conversation has moved quite rapidly to how opportunities for BAMing groups manifest themselves in the world of work. And so if you have high levels of diversity, in this case, could be based on race or the factors, if they don't have that sense of purpose and they don't have that sense of belonging, we actually start to get a kind of a disconnect approach. That's something to be mindful of there. And then like-mindedness, so similarity of thinking, can help in many ways, actually, because it can increase predictability of behavior. So we can decode quite quickly group norms. And also we have some of the conflict is actually reduced. And that's good because that helps decision-making to be much more efficient, it's much quicker, and the rest of it. So there's lots and lots and lots of positives to having similarity and this idea of kind of fit, if you like, within an organizational context. So we don't want to throw it all out. But of course, there are some clear problems with it as well. And I think some of the problems that we need to think about is what I call this kind of dark side of cultural fit. And the first thing to think about is, well, what is culture anyway? What is fit anyway, actually? I had a conversation with somebody who's a very senior executive in an organization based in Italy a couple of days ago, actually. And we were actually doing an assessment of their recruitment process. And he was talking about, they've got a set of values in their organization. And he was talking about hiring for fit. And I said to him, well, what does that mean to you? What are the anchors that you're measuring fit on? And to be quite frank, he really didn't know what I was saying. He didn't really have a clue. He just had this kind of, it's almost like a magical notion of what fit is. And his response was really, I'll know it when I see it, or I'll feel it when I see it. And I think that's one of the problems with this idea of fit, because when you base fit on emotional or that kind of instinct, what you're essentially doing is relying back on your biases. So that becomes really problematic. If you can't measure it and you can't anchor it, it becomes too subjective. And that's where the bias really has an opportunity to creep in. So I think we just need to be mindful of that. The second thing is the assumptions that culture is fixed and that therefore that diversity is supplementary. And that's just fundamentally incorrect. Two things here. One is that in many organizations, you don't have one culture. You have a set of microcultures which defines the overall culture. But cultures change, they are fluid, they adapt, and they should change, and they should be fluid, and they should adapt over time. But often what we find in a recruitment context is people hiring for this perceived notion of fit, which may have suited where the organization was 5, 10, even 15, 20 years ago, but it doesn't fit two things. One is it doesn't fit where the organization is now, and it definitely doesn't fit where the organization needs to be in the future in order to respond to some of those challenges that organizations face. And so the starting point is this idea of we have a culture and that the culture is fixed, and that the diversity that we're trying to seek to get is in addition to that, and that therefore it needs to fit into where we are. And that is clearly problematic. And so we know that when those dynamics happens, it increases the stuff that we don't want. So it increases the organization's kind of what we call perspective blindness. You'll be familiar with all of those terms around, known knowns and known unknowns and the rest of it. But, I remember years ago, we used to do scenario planning in the world of work, actually. We would try and predict, what the various kind of situations might be in 3, 5, 10, 15 years, actually. That process these days is pretty much redundant because change is much too rapid and fluid. And so we've got to think about if we are seeing diversity and difference as supplementary, the likelihood of organizational perspective blindness will increase. And that clearly has a knock-on effect in our ability to respond to the outside world. And I think it's really important because the outside world, not on a theoretical level, but on a very, very practical level, is fundamentally defined by diversity and difference. So your external stakeholders, whether it's in the NHS, for example, the patient body is clearly diverse. Whether you're working in retail, how do you make sure you tune into the different spending habits of diverse customers, etc. But you just simply can't do that. It's impossible to do that when we have too much similarity, etc. And that therefore we know that too much similarity ultimately leads to conformity. And conformity is really bad for innovation. Conformity, if it's uncontrolled conformity, it really leads to a radical kind of cloning effect in these echo chambers. And it loops us back to the conversation we had at the beginning in terms of groupthink and the rest of it. So we really need to kind of be mindful of this over focus on fit if it leads to these kind of echo chambers and these kind of collective blind spots in organizational thinking, because ultimately when that happens, we clearly don't get the innovation, we clearly don't get the creativity, we don't have the insight into new markets and the rest of it. And if you're a profit-making organization, that's clearly going to have an impact in terms of your profits. If you're a non-profit organization, that's going to have an impact in terms of your ability to deliver services to diverse stakeholders. So the basic thing that we're trying to balance, and I suppose life is full of all of these sorts of balances really. How do we balance this kind of, sameness, difference kind of quadrant, if you like, this, but also this kind of, we want some conflict. Creative conflict is useful. Creative dissent is useful. It gives us, it moves us away from harmony. And when harmony is too weighted, it goes into that kind of conformity that we've talked about. So we're balancing a number of things here. We're balancing the levels of similarity with the level of difference, and we're balancing the level of conflict with the level of harmony. And you'll see that the high performance zone is those organizations that get it right somewhere here. Now, sometimes you might move, sometimes you might want a higher level of similarity.
Dan, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but your audio's gone slightly muffled. It's not quite very clear.
Okay.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's better. I don't know if you were wearing a mic on yourself or not, but it seems to be okay now.
Okay, cool. Right, thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure what will happen actually. Not touching anything, so there you go.
I'll leave you to it.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I think what we're balancing is all of these different factors, and we might move around this quadrant at some point depending on, what organization you're in or what you're trying to achieve. And there's lots of examples. We're working with many clients at the moment that really have this this right. So it's not that you're in one fixed position. You might change positions depending on what you're trying to do. But as long as you're aware of where you are, that's the most important thing. Just quickly going back to this notion of inclusivity. So remember, we said that diversity is not the magic ingredient at all. Lots of organizations hire for difference, but then when they're in, they say, be a bit more like us. Problematic. We've got to make sure that we promote organizational cultures which are inclusive and create that sense of belonging. Because when you have an organization which is inclusive, and that's defined by people feeling that they have psychological safety, they can come into work and be themselves. They feel that their voice is heard. They have decision makings around the table. They feel that their leaders have high levels of EQ, so they can tune into how they and their different colleagues are thinking and feeling. And also this perceived levels of fairness. Once we have those ingredients, that's where we're really moving, we're motoring towards high-performing teams. And I think that's important for me, because this whole conversation about D&I is not about being politically correct or anything like that. It's about saying we need to do certain things. One is, of course, we need to eliminate discrimination and prejudice where we see it. But the other thing that we're trying to do is to create high-performing teams. And it's through these ingredients that we can do that. So how do we get over this maze? How do we navigate this maze of the need for some similarity that we've talked about, but also this need to have some level of difference as well? And actually, there's lots of research that talks about this. And one of the ways that I think is really quite interesting is about saying, can we try to measure or hire using certain anchors? And some of those anchors would be around organizational values. And there's lots of research around saying if we hire for values, actually we can navigate the stuff that we want. So we want to measure some element of similarity, i.e. the things that we value, but we don't want to drown out all of that difference based on things like, whether it's race or gender or thinking style, introverts, extroverts, etc. So there's lots of organizations that are doing this at the moment. Some we've mentioned are, the charities are classic examples of this. We mentioned Amnesty International, organizations like Oxfam and the rest of it, they often use values. The co-op, we're doing a piece of work on inclusive leadership at the co-op at the moment in terms of their different business lines. So whether it's retail or funeral care or other business units in the co-op, they are, their business is set on a whole bunch of values. It's set on a whole bunch of really positive things that it's trying to do around kind of community involvement and the rest of it. So using values as a way of measuring some kind of corporate connectivity is an interesting way of navigating this perhaps challenge that we face. So if we're going to do that, we've got to be really clear. So the first thing is about saying, mapping out what your values are and communicating those clearly. So are you and all stakeholders, particularly things like your hiring managers, clear in terms of what the values are that you're seeking to hire? So I mentioned the organization that I had a conversation with based in Italy. They're a global corporation. The hiring manager really had no clue, if I'm honest with you, in terms of what the stated organizational values were, and just using his own interpretation of perhaps what they should be. And clearly that is problematic. So mapping out the values and communicating those to stakeholders is key. Feeding that all the way through the communication channels. So we at Vercida and Vercida.com in particular really goes in and maps out all the great work that organizations are doing around not just diversity, remember, but organizational inclusivity, and maps that out and pushes that out into the marketplace. And our website really helps to attract diverse talent and candidates whose values might match the values of the organization. So communication is key. And I think the other thing is, because sometimes values seem a bit woolly and soft, but you can measure values, and you can measure values in things like candidate questionnaires. You can use situational judgment tests. There's a whole bunch of metrics that you can use to measure whether the candidate has the values and the purpose that you're looking for, actually. And again, we can share some more case studies with you after. You can ask a whole bunch of questions at the interview stage. One of the types of questions that I would not advise you asking is this one, which was a real question, which a real candidate was asked. So it was one of these, you can imagine the kind of funky startups, and they were really trying to be groovy and trying to get this sense of similarity. One of the questions that they asked is, what's your favorite pizza slice? Now, there's all sorts of problems, as you can imagine, around that question. So if you want to be funky and go with all sorts of questions around values, that's fine. But this is the type of question not to ask. The types of questions that you should be asking are these. And I won't go through all of these in detail. You can see them here, and we will send you some stuff out. But I do think you can anchor some questions on things like, so for example, we're working with a client at the moment, and one of their values is around workplace collaboration. So they're putting a lot of energy and effort on making sure that both internally, the different teams are very collaborative in their approach. And when they're hiring, they really want different stakeholders, and they actually want diverse stakeholders. But one of the things that they're trying to assess is, how people have experience or understanding of collaboration, as an example. So you can ask a whole bunch of questions in terms of, what types of culture do you thrive in? Is it hierarchical cultures? Is it cultures who share? What's your kind of personality and the rest of it? What are the sorts of values that you're drawn to, and all of that. So, as I say, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can use your recruitment processes and those tests, like the situational judgment test, based on a set of anchors, which would be these sorts of questions, aligned to the values that you're after, whether it's fairness, whether it's things like, collaboration, whether it's back to the co-op around sort of purpose and the rest of it. And I think the organizations that will do well are the ones that are able to, first of all, understand what you're trying to measure. So what are the values, how you articulate those to the marketplace, and then align all of those values through things like your assessment centers and the rest of it. So I think this is a really interesting way. And we're doing lots of work with organizations in terms of how you can navigate this balance between really wanting levels of diversity and hiring for cultural fit, if you like. So thank you very much. Hopefully there may be a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, amazing, Dan. Thank you so much. It's always great to get some insight from you guys, and always nice to hear your thoughts. We do have a couple of questions. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop up our Slido screen. So if anyone, those of you that have been listening, you can do this on your mobile or on another web browser, but please do provide some feedback for us that we're able to share with the speakers throughout. So for this particular session, you can go to slido.com and just hashtag IHR diversity. That would be great. And whilst you guys are doing it, or whilst everyone is doing that, I got told off for using guys earlier. Dan, the question that's top at the moment is, have you seen evidence of businesses proactively looking for culture ads rather than culture fit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, we have actually. So there are many organisations, and I think we're doing some work with some organisations that work in finance at the moment, actually. And there's a lot of conversations in finance, actually, in terms of this notion of kind of culture add. In terms of how does diversity add to our current thinking? So I think finance would be an organisation, and I think finance is really interesting, actually, because finance historically, because of things like the global crash and stuff like that, has had a bit of a hard time. And I think finance as a whole has a lot of work to do. Traditionally it's very white, it's traditionally very, very male and all of that. But there are organisations, there's some clients that I'm working with now that are really thinking about how does, it goes back to this idea of, diversity being additive. So how does diversity add to what we're doing? I think some of those organisations are being quite smart, because what they've done is they've measured, well, where are we now and where do we want to be? And also, I think what's really important for some of those organisations, it's saying two things, actually. What is the skill set that we're missing, which I think is really important. But the other thing, which I think is quite fascinating, actually, is what is the mindset that we're missing, actually? And I think that's such an interesting question, because it's not always easy, but how do you measure mindset, in a recruitment context? But there are ways to do it, actually. So that's what I would say, and that's a particular sector that I would kind of shout out.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And very quickly, we are running low on time, unfortunately, but for anyone else that does have questions do go and visit the Vercida stand in the main hall, and you can ask these directly. So Dan, the business case for D&I is mainly viewed from the organisation benefits and their gains. What about the benefits for individuals from those diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question. I love that question. First of all, the business case for diversity at the moment is fundamentally flawed. And the reason it's fundamentally flawed is because the starting point is about profit. So all of the data, or all of the data that you see in the headlines is, if you have diverse teams at the executive level, so all the data from McKinsey, BCG, etc., says if you have women and BME groups at the executive level, you get higher return on your investment, essentially. So you get higher profitability. That's a big problem, because the problem is that we're not putting people first. And actually, I think what we need to do is we need to fundamentally redefine what we're trying to do here and redefine the business case. And I do think it's interesting now. I think the organizations that will do well and be sustainable and it's not that profit is a bad thing. I mean, if you work, we run a profitable business, we are a consultancy business. So I'm not dissing profit, that's fine. But what I am saying is, what most organizations are doing is they don't have a people-centered approach. So if you have a people-centered approach, which is about saying, how do we make sure that the diverse talent that we have in our organization feels valued, feels respected, feels that their voice is heard, feels that not just that they have a seat at the table, but they're respected and they're given opportunities. When we start with people first, that's where you as an individual feel a really strong sense of psychological safety. You feel a really strong sense of belonging. And that's not an end in itself, because what happens is, if you feel a strong sense of psychological safety, stuff happens. So what happens is your motivation goes up, your levels of engagement goes up, your individual productivity and performance goes up. And when you times that by a whole bunch of diverse people, we start to see organizational performance going up. So what I would say is so the game needs to change. The game needs to be about saying, how can we look after our people as opposed to looking after our profit? And if we look after our people, we'll get this strong sense of bonding, and then the profitability stuff will look after itself. So I think we need to kind of start turning things on its head, if you like.